Titles, thrones, crowns, lands, power. These are the contested elements within the Game of Thrones. Humans will go to great lengths to achieve those lofty heights. We've seen in fiction and in the real world countless attempts to use military might to win these ultimate prizes. But brute force and domination is not the only tool in the power broker's arsenal. Deception can go a long way. Even now in current times, identity theft and impersonations are commonplace, and we can only imagine how the lack of photography and centralized documentation made impersonations a lot easier. The ancient world, the medieval world, Westeros, these are places where impersonations work differently. In A Song of Ice and Fire, there are many cases of deception used to win, claim, or hold the throne. Joffrey's true heritage, for example, young Griff's in another one. In the latter's case, babies can be swapped or simply produced with a conjured backstory. In other words, you can claim the babies were swapped. Doesn't mean it's true. Real-world history is chock full of such examples as well, many of which were inspirations for George. And that's our focus today. Because there's so many examples, we'll focus primarily on the ones that actually have A Song of Ice and Fire parallels, using A Song of Ice and Fire to get to those examples. Sometimes the other way, but most of the times we'll start with the Song of Ice and Fire example and show the historical parallel. And pretenders or imposters are often intertwined. After all, what's the point of impersonating a powerful person if you're not going to get something out of it, like claim a title or wealth or something like that? And that's where the pretenders come in, because a pretender, it sounds like an impersonator, but it's really just someone who's trying to claim a title. Step 1, impersonate. Step 2, claim the title. Step 3, live or die by the success of the plan. So profit or die, win or die, right? The back and forth nature of who is and who isn't a pretender is a good reflection of the overused but still often true notion that the winners write history. This is more of a built-in thing and latter historical invention. The word pretender in this context is only a few centuries old in terms of the real world. But the concept goes back way farther. The obvious, any people fighting over a crown, false king, claimant, usurper. There's lots of terms for these things. Pretender is still a little confusing because it sounds a lot like imposter, but these are very different things that are just related and overlapped. So the point being here, the holder of the crown gets to call the other person the pretender. But if that changes, then that person becomes a pretender as long as they're still fighting. It's kind of not unlike how the Brotherhood Without Banners went from king's men to rebels, because while they were off on their mission, the person who was king changed, right? This episode features some follow-ups to our Wars of the Roses episode and our Black Dinner of Scotland episodes. There's many familiar elements and some of the same historical figures that will show up in here, and some descendants of those historical figures in other cases. You don't have to have heard those episodes to keep up. They're not vital. They're just fun. They add to the full picture of this, but you could also listen to them afterwards. I don't suppose the order matters a whole lot. So if you're a fan of our historical deep dives, this one's definitely in that category. Roughly half A Song of Ice and Fire, half IRL history. Lots of intriguing new characters, familiar names you've heard a million times, like Edward, Richard, Henry, Aegon. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome back, everybody. If you are watching us live, it must be about 3 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, because that's where we're live almost every Sunday. Afterwards, though, you can find a better sounding and edited version on Spotify about a week later, and on anywhere you look for podcasts, any podcast platform, you can find our episodes as well. And if you listen to us on Patreon, ad-free. That's nice. Shout out to our good friend Nina. She knows quite a bit about a lot of these historical topics, especially the Jacobites, who, as a parallel to the Blackfires, who we'll talk about today. And she also gave me some insight on some literary insight or literary inspiration from George from The Accursed Kings, Nina's favorite. And I love to drop those notes whenever we can. This is a good time for it. Her latest blog post over on goodqueenally.tumblr.com, that's one L in Alley, is responding to a question about Alice Rivers and Luca Moore Strong's Bastards. Check it out. Also, shout out to Matt Rees, a.k.a. Aurelian Matthias Resius, Lord of House Aurelian, ruler of Domus Aurelianus and the Valley of Tanasi, wielder of Sol Invictus. It might be Valyrian steel, that blade, and keeper of the largest collection of books outside the Citadel with the motto, "We restore the world." Matt sent me 7 pages of notes for this one. He's very excited about this episode. He's been a patron for a long time and a big participator in Topics Moot, which was where this episode was first chosen. This is number 8 from Topics Moot 2025 out of 16, so about halfway through. Looking good. Yeah. And of course, that title I read is the title that Matt chose for his Patreon title. If you're a patron, you get to choose cool titles like that. At the end of this one, I'll mention some episodes that relate to this one. To stay immersed, we love to give you that opportunity. And we'll start with a trivia question, the answer of which will also be at the end. The Moon of Three Kings, which we could also call the Anarchy of King's Landing, actually only featured 2 kings. Which of the 3 kings wasn't actually claiming to be a king? Like I said, answer at the end. 22-page document today. Let me read you the titles of each section as a little teaser, and then we'll get right to it. This is our setup. Then we're going to do What Are Pretenders and Impostors? A little primer for you. The most recent pretender in A Song of Ice and Fire. Then Maegor versus Aegon the Uncrowned. Then we go through each book. Just to discuss the pretenders and cases like that with a few historical parallels, but most of the historical parallels are later in the episode. So Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, A Feast for Crows, Dance of Dragons. Then we begin our Dance of the Anarchy section, which is a play on words based on the fact that the Dance of the Dragons was inspired by the anarchy of England. These are divided into sections. We get the before, the during, the Moon of the Three Kings, Dare on the Daring, then the end, and the aftermath. So for both the dance and the anarchy, we've got quite a bit. Then we have our quote of the week, the Blackfire Rebellions and the Jacobites Risings. And that'll be it for the episode. A lot in store today. Let's get right to it. Oh, first off, we have a super chat from Corn Emperor. Appreciate that, Corn Emperor. Says, love you all. I hope all is well. Well, we are sitting here getting to tell you about some fun stuff that I enjoyed researching and reading about. So I'm doing great, honestly. This is a great place to be, telling you all about stuff that I really enjoy. So I'm lucky about that and happy about that and grateful about that. So let's do it. What are pretenders and imposters? Real quick, though, just in case you are spoiler averse for Hot D, I assume most of you aren't, or even if not all, because I assume you've read Fire and Blood. But just in case, we do have spoilers in this one. So what are pretenders and imposters? A pretender, well, it's someone who pretends, right? Or a member of the band, the Pretenders, right? Yes. But we're talking about the other definition of pretender, which is someone who is trying to claim a title. Usually royal ones, but really any title. You can be a pretender to any noble title. You can call yourself king, queen, prince, princess, emperor, lord, lady, whatever leader title it is, but you don't actually have it. You're claiming it. You're calling yourself that, but you don't actually possess it. So it can end with the pretender becoming the real thing if they win, right? One of the best examples comes up a lot is the Blackfires. We'll be talking about them today. Daemon Blackfire was a pretender who failed. Meanwhile, Robert Baratheon, solid example of a pretender who succeeded. Renly would be a good example of another pretender who failed. Stannis, a little more complicated because his status changed, so we'll talk about him a little bit. He's also still out there. And of course, Daenerys Targaryen, technically pretender to the Iron Throne. So it can be a descendant of a deposed family, relative, or the actual person that was deposed and is trying to get their throne back. Sometimes you survive being overthrown. Queen Anne popularized this word, using it to refer to her Roman Catholic half-brother James Francis Edward Stuart, who is a topic of this episode. He was the Jacobite heir of the time. In an address to Parliament in 1708, Queen Anne said, "The French fleet sailed from Dunkirk with the Pretender on board." Pretender capitalized. Well, just the P, not the whole word. So that's pretty neat. Maybe the word's only been used for roughly 300 some years. But I guess I said in the intro, the concept has been around forever. Obviously, challenges, usurpers, anything, whatever you want to call it. Now, imposter. Let's talk about that briefly. Of course, in a greater context, just like pretender, the definition is straightforward. But in this context, it's a little different because we're only focused on people who impersonate rulers or claimants, right? People who have a way to get titles. So a faceless man replacing Pate, well, that's an imposter, but it's not the kind of imposter that we care about today. Obviously, that's such a broad category. We got to break it down into subcategories. Now, if a faceless man were to, say, impersonate Rhaegar Targaryen, that would count if they were trying to claim the throne. If he just tried to be Rhaegar Targaryen to, get women to sleep with him, that doesn't really count. That's a different kind of impostiture. So, and of course, you don't need supernatural elements. You don't need faceless men. Obviously, the real world is full of imposters, and they're not using faceless men technology or supernatural stuff. So, yeah. Anyway, you can just use lies. That's the general way it works, like such as claiming you're the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and sounding so very sincere about it because you are sincere about it, because you were raised to believe it. There's a chance it's even true. I personally don't think Aegon is the son of Rhaegar, but it's a great example for us either way. An unwitting imposter and a pretender. This is quite simply someone who, right, pardon the confusion, pretends to be one of the above, or pretends to be an heir of the legitimate family. That's why pretender and imposter kind of get confusing when they're used together, even though they need to be, because they're so intertwined into Song of Ice and Fire and the real world. Like for Joffrey, like Aegon, imposter, but never a pretender. Because the imposture worked, enough people were convinced, or at least played along, that Joffrey was truly a Baratheon, right? He had to fight to keep his throne, but he didn't have to really do much to get it in the first place. Thanks to, Littlefinger and Cersei and all that. Roose Bolton is using a fake Arya, but this is sort of a pretender situation, but you could argue it isn't, because Arya's not the ruling lady, though the imposter play is about claiming Winterfell. So I think it probably is a pretender situation, but one that could be arguably be already resolved temporarily. Gaiman Palehair, another good example here, a false claim that he was the son of Aegon II. And this is based on an IRL example, a man called Lambert Simnel, who we will delve into a bit later. The most recent pretender. When the series begins, it's roughly the year 298, maybe 297 during the prologue. Doesn't really matter too much. The most recent pretender is Balon Greyjoy. Here's the World of Ice and Fire, referring to the period after Robert Baratheon became king. Quote,
6 years after he was crowned, Balon Greyjoy unlawfully rose against his king, not for any harm done to him or to his people, but merely out of wanton ambition. Lord Stannis Baratheon, Robert's middle brother, led the royal fleet against Lord Greyjoy, while King Robert himself rode at the head of a mighty host. Great feats of arms were performed by King Robert when Pike was eventually taken and subdued. The king then made Balon Greyjoy, the pretender to the crown of the Iron Isles, bend the knee to the Iron Throne. And, as assurance of his fealty, his only surviving son was taken hostage.
Narrator. His only surviving son was not assurance of his fealty. He went right for it, even with Theon in captivity. Theon got away, but Balon wouldn't have paused his or not started his second rebellion because of Theon. Now, there's a semantic argument here. Whether being crowned is what makes you a pretender, or actually achieving stability and peace under your authority. Are you a king? Sorry, not being crowned makes you a pretender, but makes you a king. Are you king the moment you crowned yourself? Or was Balon never actually king because he didn't succeed? Was he... It's a matter of perspective. The Ironborn treated him like a king the minute he called himself a king. For the most part, they followed his order. I mean, it's not that much different than following his orders as the Lord. So it's really just as simple as his title has changed. We're still following his orders. His orders are to go against the king, the king on the Iron Throne. That could get us all killed. But they still did it. They clearly followed him. And yeah.
I assume all Ironborn historians call him King Balon.
Good point. but like Maesters at the Citadel, I don't know. It doesn't call him King Balon in this passage. It says crowned himself, unlawfully rose. Yeah, but that's part of because he lost. If he had won, they'd probably be forced to admit, yeah, that's a king now. He won and he's an independent country or kingdom. So I tend to side with the latter. I think putting a crown on your head and calling yourself king is too low a bar. Yeah, I think you actually have to like win, even if only briefly.
I mean, I could put a crown on my head and call myself king right now.
Exactly my point. I'd follow you though. So you'd have at least one follower, and and our cats would follow you too. So we'd have at least 5 of us, in an army there. Are you going to put me in charge of the cats, or do I have to follow one of their orders?
Yeah, no, you're definitely following their orders.
I'm just a grunt. I'm just a foot soldier in this army. Maegor versus Aegon the Uncrowned. This is another case where the heir was usurped completely, and perhaps completely by surprise, because it doesn't seem like he saw it coming at all. He certainly wasn't prepared for it. And it's the first case of a pretender and a usurpation under the Iron Throne. Here's what we're told, quote,
"Though Lyman Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, stood firm when Maegor demanded that Aegon and his sister be returned to King's Landing, quote, in chains if need be, even he would not go so far as to pledge his sword to the youth who now found himself being called, quote, the Pretender and, quote, Aegon the Uncrowned."
So the lawful heir became a pretender just like that because he was usurped while he was away from the capital. And he failed to overcome that. He wasn't able to take it back. Maegor killed him in a dragon-on-dragon battle that probably shouldn't have happened. I mean, what are you doing going up against Balerion with Quicksilver there? That is a tiny dragon versus a huge one. Anyway, Maegor was not king for very long. Was it 4 years, 6 years? I forget. And he eventually lost to another pretender, a certain Jaehaerys. Yes, Jaehaerys was technically a pretender very briefly because Maegor's reign collapsed so fast. It wasn't much of a conflict, but technically Jaehaerys would have had pretender status very briefly there.
It's interesting that Jaehaerys doesn't rewrite history to, give Aegon more, lawfulness.
It's tricky because if he were to do that, he would maybe be admitting that his older sister was the true heir and not him.
Yeah.
Because Rhaena still survived and that, so it gets complicated. And Rhaena did complain about that a little bit. Fair, fairly, you got to say. But you bring up a good point. Yeah, it does. These things are not simple in some cases. A lot of it is a matter of perspective. Now, of course, there were many non-violent pretenders at the Great Council of 101 upon Jaehaerys' death, 55 some years later. They weren't called pretenders. It wasn't like a group of pretenders, because it kind of gives the wrong impression. Technically, it's true, though, I think.
Yeah, what is a pretender but a claimant?
Yeah, I mean, a pretender and a claimant are, I think, not all claimants are pretenders, but all pretenders are claimants, I think you could say.
Yes.
Or maybe I said that backwards. Either way.
I think you said it right.
Okay, good.
You said it right.
And we'll have a lot more historical examples too, which are mostly Civil War type scenarios in the second half. Let's go into A Song of Ice and Fire first. A Game of Thrones. With the title, A Game of Thrones, you would indeed expect a fight for the throne or thrones, and thus pretenders are a sure thing. And, well, that is exactly what happens. Meanwhile, imposters are a fun tool in a storyteller's arsenal, one made extra potent because there's so many real-world examples surrounding titles and pretenders. Imposter pretenders, right? Kind of sounds like a repetitive thing, but no. Even before the War of Five Kings began, which really kind of kicked off in Clash of Kings, not Game of Thrones, but we'll say Viserys, Dany's brother, was a pretender. He's the first one we see in that role, while Balon's is the most recent attempt. Viserys is the first active pretender that we see kind of walking around. Now, Robert, very early on, was afraid that Daenerys' child would also become a pretender to the throne. They weren't actually that worried about Viserys. They were more worried about this unborn child, which they were right to be. Viserys, not a big threat, unless you consider who was backing him. That part's threatening. But he died quickly. And in fact, after the wine cellar incident, which was blamed on Robert, which fair play, he was trying to assassinate Dany, Drogo does name his unborn son Rhaego as a pretender. He says, I will place my son on the iron, well, he says iron chair. Same difference, right? As an aside, how does this work with Khals? There's not really pretenders. You can't really be a pretender to a Khalasar because they follow strength. When a Khal dies, you might say, you have pretender Khals who are trying to form new Khalasars, but you don't really see Khalasars get taken over by others. Sort of. You might see remnants of them join new ones, but it's another scenario where perspective and culture changes the equation here. Khalasar is already something like a mobile nation, a mobile kingdom. So if you think of it that way, yeah, it's like this type of kingdom that only lasts as long as its current ruler. So it is hard to have claims to things that don't exist later. Then we learn pretty quickly, though, as one of the major plot lines in the Game of Thrones, that Joffrey and his siblings are imposters. They're not pretenders because they're already on the throne. But Renly knows this, and because of it, he leaves to become a pretender, jumping right over his brother. Ned, meanwhile, tries to name Stannis as the true heir, because he is by the laws of Westeros, but that bid fails because, it's not so simple to prove, and Stannis isn't really that excited about working directly with Ned. He's too proud, especially early on in the books. So he's a pretender as soon as he, in any of these circumstances, because he didn't directly inherit, even if he should have. Joffrey was crowned, his authority legitimized. That makes Stannis a pretender, unless Stannis says, I bend the knee. I'm not pushing my claim. You don't just become a pretender because you have a claim. You have to push it. You can't just have a claim. That's not enough. Meanwhile, baby Rhaego dies. So that makes it Dany a pretender to the Iron Throne. She wasn't one at first, like I said, but she obviously is for the vast majority of the series, at least so far. So Balon, as we said, was a pretender, but not an imposter. He could also be called a restorer because he was trying to bring back a crown that had formerly existed. Robb, though, I don't think you could call him a pretender because he was crowned, he was successful, and it was a new kingdom, right? It's a founding. The Kingdom of the North had existed before, but this wasn't the Kingdom of the North. This was the Kingdom of the North and Rivers, a kingdom that had never before existed. You could argue that he was still a pretender. He was trying to claim a title that he made up. So that's where semantics is like, I'm not sure. But arguably his kingdom was never actually established. It was wartime, and the war resulted in him losing, even though he won all those battles. Still, Mance Rayder, an interesting case, is another one where the laws are different. You got a different cultural situation. It's got some elements of Westeros and some elements of Khalasars, where kings beyond the wall don't really come from bloodlines. It has nothing to do with dynastic considerations. It's about following strength. Someone claims it temporarily, but most of the time there isn't one. So, and I can't think of an example where a free folk king was challenged from within for rulership of the free folk. It's like free folk king, that person dies, back to the status quo. You don't have like someone who takes over afterwards. It doesn't really happen. But if you ask the least Baratheon, they're trying to overlay the Westerosi system on the free folk, and they're like, yeah, Raymond Redbeard should be king because he's descended from the last king beyond the wall, even though there were plenty of kings beyond the wall before him. So it's very arbitrary, but they actually have Raymond Redbeard's descendants in their, in their court. So that's why they're picking that arbitrary person, because they have that power. Moving forward to Clash of Kings, technically this is when Balon actually launches his bid. He doesn't do anything in a Game of Thrones besides get ready for it. We find out he's been preparing all this time. So you could argue that it counts. Either way, it doesn't matter. The point is that he did it. So Joffrey is actually crowned, and as the lawful heir of Robert, and even though he's an imposter, Stannis is the lawful heir, but a pretender, and Renly is a pretender too, but he's killed. Here's where we get our first historical parallel. Owain Logok. I'm probably saying that wrong. First of all, I'm a guy with a name that gets mispronounced a lot. I believe it's a good thing to try to pronounce people's names correctly, but we got to have some leeway, especially when languages are really tricky. Welsh is so tricky. The words are hard for our mouths to form because we aren't using sounds that we're used to, and the letters don't sound the same. Like D means TH in Welsh, and so the letters that you are very familiar with work differently in Welsh. It's really confusing. Anyway, that's why so many Welsh names are anglicized. Owain Logok is really not what they would have called him. They would have pronounced it way differently. But anyway, I don't know how to say it. So he was a direct descendant of Llewellyn the Great, making him claimant to the Welsh crown and a pretender. So, but the Welsh crown didn't exist. It was subject to England. So this is kind of like Balon Greyjoy. He wanted to restore the former principality like Dorne of Wales. It wasn't a kingdom, it was a principality. Now, before he launched his bid, he was the leader of a free company that fought in the 100 Years' War. So there you go, a sellsword company type situation, a guy who led a sellsword company. So you got a little bit of a Golden Company vibe here too, don't we? With a sellsword company commander who goes on to make a claim for a crown. So he announced his intent to claim the Welsh throne in the year of 1372. Initially, he had no success, but didn't die or anything. He was able to try again in 1377. But England got really sneaky. Instead of fighting it out on the battlefield, they sent some guy named John Scott Lamb to kill him. And this guy, he wasn't just like walked up and stab him or like wait for him in a dark alley. No, he gained his confidence. Like conned him into being like, hey, I'm your friend. Became one of his squires and then stabbed him. What, he just like putting on his armor, helping him put on his armor, like, boop, gotcha. So that was the end of him. So he was the last direct pretender to the Welsh throne until Owain Glendower, another one that's not how the Welsh would say it, but another Owain that's neat. He tried to overthrow English rule in Wales like not long after. So we had 1377. This guy was killed shortly after. Owain Glendower started a 15-year war in the year 1400. So only 20 some years later. He also was pretender to the throne of Wales, was trying to restore the principality. But interestingly, he claimed descent from all three royal houses of Wales. All three. So same as Balon Greyjoy and Owain Logok, he was trying to restore a crown that had been conquered. My apologies for comparing Balon Greyjoy to either of these Owains, because those are national heroes in Wales and Balon Greyjoy is a villain. At one point, this Owain Glendower, he was a great soldier and commander. He served John of Gaunt, which you may recall from the Wars of the Roses episodes. He was the Lancastrian progenitor, one of them anyway, the main one. And then his son, John of Gaunt's son, a certain Henry of Bolingbroke, who eventually became King Henry IV, who was the king that Owain Glendower led this revolt against. So that's pretty interesting. This guy served the king before he was king and then led a revolt against him. So this is personal almost. Another familiar name comes up here because earlier in this revolt, Owain lost a battle to Hotspur, the character, the real like person who the character Fireball is based on. And we've mentioned him before as well. But Hotspur, after beating Owain in this battle, he retired from English service and, went back to France and had nothing to do with the rest of the 14 years of this 15-year war. Owain started to have more success after that. And of course, whenever you're going to war with England, what you should do in this era, what you should always do is talk to France and maybe Scotland, because France loves to help any enemy of England. So Wales is fighting for their independence. France is like, let's help you out. If Scotland's fighting their independence, France is like, let me help you out. So, and Wales is like, hey, Scotland, we could both do this a little together. Let's fight the English together. Yeah. It's a bit like how the Ironwoods would always help the Blackfires, perhaps, but there's not a great parallel in A Song of Ice and Fire for that rotating situation there. In 1413, this Henry IV died. So Owain actually outlasted Henry IV. Then Henry V ascended. Remember, Henry V was our parallel to Baelor the Blessed and Aerys the Mad. So his situation was what we kicked off the Wars of the Roses episode with, because he was king when the Wars of the Roses began. He took a much lighter, softer, peaceful approach to this rebellion, even though it had been going on for so long. Well, again, this is a Baelor the Blessed parallel guy, so he's like, yeah, let's work for a truce. Let's try to back this down rather than one side annihilating the other. However, Owain died, but we don't know when or how. Sometime around 1415, 1416 maybe, but we don't know how it happened. No one ever snitched on him that we know of, because there was a huge bounty on his head, but Wales was just so behind him. People left their jobs in England. People just like picked up and left the farms and the stores and shops to flee to Wales to join his rebellion. It was a really big deal. So there was a lot of loyalty there. But yeah, we don't know how he died. And even though there was confusion because of that death, there were no imposters of him. That's something we're going to see a lot of in this episode, and something you'll see a lot if you study this topic in real life, is when there's confusion over someone's death, that opens the door for imposters to become pretenders. Owain's cousin. So we just talked about Owain Logok and Owain Glendower, and Glendower's cousin, who was named Owain, was the father of the Tudor dynasty, which, of course, ended up taking England at the end of the Wars of the Roses. So, moving on to A Storm of Swords. Even though Storm of Swords is a big book of climaxes and exciting stuff, not much actually changes in terms of kings and queens and rulers. In terms of pretenders, you've got people dying, but that's the end of it. Like, Robb dies, but his crown just goes away. No one's trying to claim it anymore. There's no pretender to that crown. Roose might try to push for the king in the north eventually, but that would be not Robb's kingdom, because Roose isn't going to try to rule the Riverlands. They wouldn't follow him anyway. Now, Joffrey is killed too, but that doesn't change much because Tommen takes over, and Tommen's also an imposter, just like his brother, under the same circumstances. Dany, still a pretender to the Iron Throne. That hasn't changed. But she also somewhat claims the throne of Meereen. I say somewhat because Meereen hasn't had a king or a queen in like 1,000 years. And she's not fully ruling like a queen, but kind of is. And she intends to leave. And everybody knows that. So it's a little tricky in that situation. Now, Balon's also killed by Euron, or by a faceless man hired by Euron. And Euron becomes a pretender because he tries to seize the Seastone chair after Balon's death, but doesn't entirely succeed because of the Kingsmoot. And then he just succeeds there instead. But you could call him a pretender during that time. And all the people who showed up for the Kingsmoot in A Feast for Crows would be claimants, pretenders as well. Now, of course, let's talk about A Feast for Crows. Not from A Feast for Crows, but this quote that Shay is about to read is from The World of Ice and Fire, because The World of Ice and Fire is written during A Song of Ice and Fire, and this passage in the book happens around the same time King Tommen becomes King Tommen. Quote,
"The death of the noble hand, Jon Arryn, has unleashed a madness on the land, a madness of pride and violence. The madness has robbed the realm of Robert and of his fair son and heir, Joffrey. Pretenders strive to steal the Iron Throne, and disturbing rumors of dragons reborn trickle in from the east. In such times of trouble, we must all pray that good King Tommen shall see a long reign and a just one, to usher us again out of the darkness and into the light."
The phrase "times of trouble" is a clever one. I don't know if George did it on purpose, but in Russia, there were the times of trouble where they were troubled by multiple false Dimitris. And we'll talk about the false Dimitris later in this episode when we have the A Song of Ice and Fire parallel alongside it. But this quote just happened now, so I had to throw that out there. So Asha's a pretender now, right? She didn't accept the results of the Kingsmoot. In her mind, it was the Queen's moot. So Euron has the Driftwood clown. I did it again. Driftwood clown. There we go.
We have a very old funnies, gag reel, whereas he says Driftwood clown. That always makes me laugh.
Well, we unfortunately lost that gag reel. Remember, it got accidentally deleted when we had a hard drive crash. It was very sad.
It was years of
oops that were funny. But anyway, we can start a whole new one. Driftwood clown. So you could call Euron the Driftwood clown. Why not? He's got makeup and he's kind of silly. he's a more like the clown from like It, or a lot of these slasher films or something like that. Anyway, but so is Asha the pretender, or is she going to push her brother as the pretender, using the good brother example from Ironborn history, where a person was allowed to make their play for the Iron Isles because they were not at the Kingsmoot? It's like, hey, it was not fair. He wasn't at the Kingsmoot. He should have a chance. So, but beyond that, Euron is actually a pretender too. Not to the Sea Stone chair. He's got that on lockdown for now. To the Iron Throne. He wants the Iron Throne. He wants all of Westeros. Honestly, he wouldn't call himself that. He would call, in his mind, his vision is much grander. He doesn't just want to conquer Westeros. He kind of wants like the whole world. I don't know. This guy's got delusions of grandeur. He does lots of drugs. But still, we can call him a pretender to the Iron Throne. You just got to say there's more than that on top of it. Turning our attention to a much smaller, minor example that is introduced, I think... No, it's introduced before A Feast for Crows, but it gets a little more play in A Feast for Crows because we have Dornish chapters, which is the Vulture Kings. There's various attempts to carve out a kingdom in the Red Mountains of Dorne. There's been, I think, 3 or 4 Vulture Kings. None of them succeeded because, well, there's no Vulture Kingdom now, is there? never was for more than the length of these rebellions took. None of them ever stuck. But definitely they count as pretenders to the Vulture King throne, whatever that means. The Vulture Crown. The Vulture Crown. Yeah, we'll call it that. The Dance of Dragons. Stannis still pretending, way up in the north. Hasn't given up. Still a pretender. Aegon joins the chat. A new pretender, even though the plot for Aegon has been around since Arya heard Varys and Illyrio talking amidst the dragon skulls. He's definitely a pretender. He wasn't one until he announced his bid, but he certainly has now. He's landed in Westeros. He's calling himself Aegon, calling himself the son of Rhaegar. Now, here's where it gets tricky, because if he's a Blackfire, he's a pretender and an imposter. An imposter because he's claiming to be a Targaryen, right? But he's a pretender either way, because the Baratheons have the throne right now, not the Targaryens or the Blackfires. So he's trying to take the throne, so he's a pretender. But while this is ongoing, while these are all plot lines are happening elsewhere, Davos actually wonders briefly if Lord Manderley is going to present an imposter Stark. He's like, does Manderley have a pretender Stark hidden that he's going to act like is a real Stark? But of course, it turns out he has a line on the actual Rickon Stark. But it's interesting that Davos has this thought, maybe as a way for George to nod to the fact that is what's happening with Winterfell, and a fake imposter Arya is being used to claim Winterfell. Between the latter 2 books, there's a lot of non-royal / title claimant related imposters. Not exactly the kind of imposter we're looking at today, or sort of. Like they relate, they overlap, they're cousins of the situation, or you could say maybe they do count. I don't know. I'd rather say them than not. Mance Rayder, again, we bring him up, and the baby situation with them. That's real tricky, right? Mance's child getting swapped with Gilly's child. Which one's the baby? Which one's an imposter? Well, they're both babies. Which one's an imposter for the throne? Which one's a claimant? Which one's a pretender? Are any of them? It gets the supernatural elements thrown in there with Melisandre and Kingsblood. It's all a mess of supernatural and competing claims and imposture. It's very tricky, but still, we get it, basically. I think we all kind of understand what's going on there. Meanwhile, Jane is Arya, with Theon helping sell the lie, and Aegon, big part of the whole plot here, who does count as a pretender. Now, here's where we have an example from George and his likely influence from the Accursed Kings. We have a resident Accursed Kings expert in Nina Krusling here. So, Louis X, who is called Louis the Quarrelsome, was poisoned. And the new king is a baby. There's a wet nurse for this newborn king, and she was chosen in part because she just had her own baby, right? Her baby kind of looks like the baby king. A lot of babies look similar. It's easier to swap one baby for another than it is an adult or even a child. But her child is the healthier of the 2 babies. So when it comes time for the baby king to be presented at court in front of all the nobles and like the coming out party, you know how they do these things to present the royal baby, right? They decide to swap the babies, not to take the crown or anything like that, just to make the baby look healthier, just to give everyone more confidence. It's just show this healthier baby and pretend it's the king. It's only temporary. Unfortunately, this was the opportunity that one of these nobles seized upon to kill the king. So they murder the baby, the imposter baby. In real life, this isn't what happened. We don't think. We don't know for sure, actually. The baby just dies within 5 days, which is, I mean, that just happens. Like, in those days, infants dying, it's not uncommon. So you can't really say that it was poison, but Maurice Drouin was like, hey, let's make it poison. Why not? That'll be more interesting. So the false baby king is killed, but they keep it a secret because they're like, that was an imposter. We can't reveal that this is the real king. They'll kill that baby too. So they hide the baby in a convent, and many years later, the truth comes out, or at least it threatens to. That's part of the plot. I don't need to spoil all of Cursed King. It's 7 books. I didn't spoil much there. So think of the poor wet nurse there in this scenario as a parallel to Gilly, who is forced into this, forced to give up her real baby to take care of a baby that's not hers, that's actually a royal baby. So it's just, yeah. You can see the similarity there, can't you? Dance of the Anarchy. Yes, of course, the Anarchy is the famous real-world war that George famously and openly says he was inspired to write the Dance of the Dragons on. I'm sure most all of you know that by now, but there is a lot of reason for this, a lot of detail, and a lot to talk about that we have not done before, even though we have touched on these parallels in the past, more as a glossing over. This, we're going to get into it pretty big here. It's sort of like fiddling while Rome burns, dancing while England or a fictional continent like shaped a lot like England is plunged into anarchy. Yeah. Well, remember that a phrase used during the anarchy in England was the time when Christ and his saints slept, because it was like God had turned his face from England. Things were so bad. The two factions were so busy trying to win the throne that they were not dealing out justice. They were not protecting the commoners. Rebel barons, robber knights were everywhere causing problems, and there was no one to stop them. So Empress Matilda was heir to the throne of England. But like Viserys I and Rhaenyra, King Henry had a hard time getting the nobility to accept her as his heir. Even though she was an empress in her own right, because she was Empress, Holy Roman Empress. She was married to the Holy Roman Empire. So this would have been her second crown, basically, if she had won it. She was usurped by her cousin Stephen while she was late stage pregnant overseas, like Rhaenyra was. Except instead of her cousin, it was her brother Aegon, and of course it was the throne of Westeros instead, and Dragonstone instead of France. But you can see that's very similar, right? But unlike the Dance of the Dragons, the anarchy, it was 4 years before any fighting broke out. Stephen usurped, but no one started fighting right away. They were like, hey, don't do that. But it took a while to get the armies and they argued about it. There were some legal challenges, I suppose, and so it took a while for fighting to begin. The Dance of the Dragons only lasted less than 3 years. So that's one major difference here. And that's something I want to say as an aside. Sometimes we get really deep into the weeds with these comparisons, and it might start to seem like, wow, George borrowed a lot from these. It's not really the case. Yes, he did borrow a good bit, but there's so much that isn't the same. We're just not focused on that because there's no parallel to it. There's so much that George created on his own, and so much that he took, borrowed, and just changed a little bit. So yeah, don't ever let yourself think that. Don't think that because we're taking a narrow slice that this is how it all is. Anyway, Matilda, like Rhaenyra, like Aegon the Uncrowned, became a pretender to the throne she had been lawful heir to, right? So before, the setup kind of similar. You are familiar with the setup to the dance for the most part. Great Council, 28 years of back and forth between the families. We don't have to rehash all that. Rival factions with strong claims and huge amounts of military power. Now, Westeros, way bigger than England. Regardless of the shape being similar, it's way bigger. So that's a factor you have to keep in mind too. And also during that before era, you could say Daemon was a pretender to the Kingdom of the Stepstones, which he succeeded in, and then he just gave it up. He's like, I'm bored of this. But once he created it, it's one of those things that once you make a kingdom, other people are like, that's a kingdom. I can take that. If it's just a loose collection of regions, no one thinks of it that way until someone takes it and unites it into one, even if it's briefly, like it was for Daemon. Now, all of a sudden, the whole world sees it as that region. It's a kingdom now. It's no longer just the Stepstones. So Daemon was king of the Narrow Sea, and 5 different men claimed that crown after he gave it up. 5 different people in a fairly short period of time. 15-ish years, 20-ish years? And the 5th of those was slain by none other than Racalio Rindoon, who, of course, went on to claim the kingdom of the Narrow Sea for himself. He lost it but wasn't killed in the attempt. So part of how they motivated Aegon, as in Aegon II, was convincing him he'd be executed or murdered if he didn't usurp the throne. They were like, he didn't want to do it, but then they're like, man, they're going to kill you though. And he's like, oh, in that case, all right, let's go. There isn't really a comparison from the Anarchy here. Historians debate what the motivations of Stephen and his inner circle was, but it wasn't fear of being executed. Stephen was married to a daughter of William the Conqueror. Confusingly enough, her name was also Matilda. But so he had a powerful claim, and William the Conqueror, I mean, that's the guy that conquered England. That's a really important a little important bloodline to have. But Stephen was, not in danger of being executed. It would have been highly unusual. Stephen was captured at one point. And they let him go. Like, there was a ransom. They just agreed. It's like, what? Isn't that weird? That would never have happened during the dance, right? No, if one side had gotten their hand on the other claimant, executed. I mean, that is what happened, right? But here, this was an era in which it's hard to say war was more civilized, but I mean, that's kind of like, it's such a weird thing to call civilized at all. But it was more civilized. There was less killing of people. It's still terrible. Still lots of murder and death and devastation. But yeah, it's good to see history creeping a little bit towards not killing people. Of course, sometimes leaving people alive causes bigger problems. When you leave someone alive and they just escape and launch a fresh claim, like Bittersteel did, escaping on his way to the wall, right? Maybe if they had executed him, that wouldn't have happened. During the Anarchy and the Dance of the Dragons, so Aegon usurped the throne right away, and Rhaenyra immediately declared her intent to take it back. So technically, she's the pretender, but then she took it back. So he became the pretender. The counter argument would be that she never actually held it in a time of peace, but neither did he. The war started the second he usurped it. He did it, and he only had it briefly at the end before getting poisoned himself. Was that really a time of peace? According to Westeros history, the way it was written, yes, Aegon II counts. Rhaenyra doesn't, which is always the kind of thing where we're like, I think she should have counted. But history is written by the winners. Maybe someday they'll fix that. They'll edit history and change it. You think that's weird? You think that someone changing history 150 years, 200 years later, because I don't know when this would happen. Maybe it happens 50 years after the end of the books. Real world is full of such examples. Let me tell you, rewriting history can happen hundreds of years later, where someone that's a pretender can be called a king, someone that's a usurper can be called, the lawful person. It's really just about interpretations of the law. Different generations, different people will interpret these laws, especially when they're hundreds of years old. The interpretations are harder to hold true or to stick to the original vibe of the original of the first version of that, because you don't know what they were thinking 200 years ago. You only know the details, like, well, who was son of who and who was queen of this, and they don't have all the detail of that era, nor do they have the values of that era. The culture, what they care about, changes over time. So, in any case, both Aegon and Rhaenyra called each other pretender in the sources, back and forth. It was part of the war of words that happens during any war of swords, and it's convenient that you can just take the S off of swords and you've got war of words. Yeah. The debate might include the fact that while Rhaenyra lost the throne, she didn't lose it to the Greens. She just lost it, right? That's the Moon of Three Kings, right? The Greens didn't take it from her. She just couldn't hold it and had to flee and never got it back. And the Greens reclaimed it, but they also didn't keep it very long. So they're also paralleled by Empress Matilda. Empress Matilda actually did seize London. And she was going to have a coronation, but the people were like, riots. She had to leave. The unrest in London was so severe, she left, just like Rhaenyra. Now, the difference, of course, that there wasn't like a Moon of Three Kings in London. There wasn't like rioting in the streets and multiple false claimants just popping up. That's something George came up with, and it was very fun. That's going to be a big part of the second half. Now, the Anarchy was nodded at by the Moon of Three Kings and King's Landing because it is an anarchy in King's Landing. And we get imposters and pretenders in that event. Now, again, as I said before, the anarchy was characterized by a lack of justice and law being done because the two factions were so busy ripping each other apart. This wasn't as big a deal in Westeros because the war was short. Yes, there were people that took advantage of the opening, especially Dalton Greyjoy, the Red Kraken. He took advantage of it more so than anyone else. He seized territory on the west and dared anyone to do anything about it. They couldn't because they were too busy fighting each other. They couldn't deal with him while they were fighting for the throne. Under the Anarchy, remember, it lasted way longer, 15 years. So what you get is a scenario where the first couple of years, some of these robber knights and unlawful barons, tyrannical lords, they start testing the waters. They're like, I can get away with this. I can get away with this. I can get away with this. A little time goes by, they got away with it. A year goes by. They go a little bolder, get away with more, get away with more, still get away with it. No justice, no pushback. After years and years of this, they're just going to be extremely bold and just extremely tyrannical and just extremely grasping and corrupt and greedy because 15 years of no pushback on this lawlessness, they're just going to get more bold and more brutal, and people are just going to get more scared. This is a microcosm of the Moon of Three Kings. The realm at large wasn't overwhelmingly lawless, like I said, because the war just didn't drag on that long. But King's Landing was. King's Landing did fall into that state, and that's what we will talk about when we come back. Hey folks, we've got something pretty exciting over on our Patreon page. We have so many episodes these days that occasionally we think about the fact that it's kind of hard to find the episode you want sometimes. We tell you, hey, we've got this episode, then you're like, where is that? I got to scroll through this 12 years of RSS feed to find an episode. Sometimes it's tricky. And sometimes you don't know what you're looking for. So Ashea built an episode database searcher that allows you to find episodes using a number of different criteria. It's really good. I'm going to let her take over here.
Yeah, I've got it on screen as well if you're seeing visually. But yeah, basically it's a feed that intakes our Spotify and YouTube feed. So it has podcast and video versions. It has all of our shorts. I have it set to tag based on like Doom of Valyria, and you click and it takes you to Doom of Valyria related things. Or you click on guest Lady Gwyn and it'll take you to the episodes that Lady Gwyn is tagged in. And you can type and search things, Gwyn, and it'll come up like that. You can see a whole list of all of the tags, of which there are honestly a really crazy amount. But I just feel like we have it like cataloged here. We have 511 episodes. It's not actually our full catalog because this doesn't include paid private episodes, ones that we made unlisted because they're quite old. So it is not comprehensive. We actually have more than this. But I think this should help any Patreon member just, use our catalog a little bit better, a little bit more efficiently. It can be really hard to find episodes. So I hope you like it.
And the problem's only going to get bigger over time. As we just described, the anarchy got worse and worse. When we keep adding episodes, this is going to get harder and harder to search our back catalog unless you use a tool like this or some other search feature. So yeah, sign up at patreon.com/History of Westeros and enjoy that benefit and lots of others like bonus episodes, titles, and participation in episode selection like Topics Moot. Something to keep in mind with the concept of royal or noble imposters conceptually is that it isn't a lot of crimes where even if the culprits escape justice, the crime is eventually discovered. For example, if someone were to steal a bunch of money from a company, it might not be noticed right away. But eventually, like an accounting is going to be done and be like, hey, there's $40 million missing. But not all crimes get solved. Not all crimes even are ever identified as crimes. What I mean by that is every example of an imposter we have from real world history here is one where the imposter was discovered and failed. Because if they didn't, we wouldn't know. If they succeeded, there would be no historical record of it. They wouldn't be listed as an imposter. If they were never discovered to be an imposter, how would we know? So that's kind of a win. Like, oh, really? Yeah, you're right. There might have been some kings and queens or emperors or lords and ladies that faked it and got away with it. Now, in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's a little different because we have inside information that humans wouldn't have. We're inside people's heads. We have the equivalent of narrator. It's not really a narrator, but we have the equivalent of a narrator from this perspective because we get direct thoughts that we wouldn't always have. But not always. Like, we don't always know because we're not in the POV. We don't have everyone as a POV. We're not in everyone's heads. So, yeah. Now, in real life, some of these imposters are very well documented, though the farther back we go, generally speaking, that's less true. I mean, that's standard, right? The farther you go back in history, the less there's written about it, for the most part. Do you recall the example of Margaret of Norway from our Black Dinner episode? She was the 7-year-old who was Queen of Norway, who was going to marry the King of Scotland, and she died on the way. What we didn't tell you at that time was there was a fake Margaret who came up, an imposter Margaret who's like, hey, I'm that Margaret. And I want not just the throne of Norway, but I want the throne of Scotland too, even though Margaret never actually married into it and it wouldn't have been hers because she married into it. Like, you don't get that's not how it works. Also, she was 30 years older than the actual Margaret would have been. This wasn't the best attempt ever at an imposter. And some imposters have, happy endings, like Gaiman Palehair and his real world parallel. Well, Gaiman Palehair didn't really have that happy of an ending since he died of poison, but he could have had a happy ending. This Margaret, very unhappy ending, burned at the stake. The famous Darius the Great, as in the third king of Persia, became king after revealing that the current king, Bardia, I don't know how to say it, was an imposter. He's like, everybody, that's not Bardia, it's an imposter. It's the mage Gaumata. Mage, yeah, the Magi, like an astrologer. But historians aren't sure about this. They think this might have been a trumped up claim. He might have just told everyone that Bardia was an imposter, and it might have been completely made up. He might have been making up an imposter story to kill his cousin or brother, older brother, I forget which. He was definitely related to Bardia. So that's a way that the imposter thing can work the other way. You can take a real person, call them an imposter. If you can get enough support, people will believe it, and there you go. Now, Darius, so I guess in the effort to do this, he was a pretender, and then he succeeded, and then he's the great king. All right, let's get into the Moon of the Three Kings and the Two Princes in the Tower. So this is where we not only include elements from the Anarchy, but also from the ends of the Wars of the Roses, where the famous two princes in the tower, Edward and Richard, the nephews of Richard III, who usurped them and took their throne and probably had them killed. Here is a quote to kick us off about the Moon of the Three Kings.
Madness gripped the city after Rhaenyra fled, and it showed itself in many ways. Strangest of all was the rise of two pretender kings who reigned during the time remembered as the Moon of the Three Kings.
Two pretender kings, it says, during the Moon of Three Kings, because the shepherd was the third, but he wasn't trying to be a king. He was just a leader that had a lot of followers, like these other two, Gaiman and Trystane Truefire. So, yes, the Moon of Three Kings has some parallels with the two princes in the tower. And hey, two kings, two princes. Yeah, all right. So to stoke your memory, again, these were the sons of Robert, who we called Robert Edward. Actually, King Edward IV, but we called him Robert Edward because he's so much in common with Robert Baratheon. Now, Richard was the brother of Edward, the younger brother of Edward IV, and Edward IV had sons named Edward and Richard. Richard III, of course, was a Stannis Eddard parallel, right? Now recall what we said earlier about Daeron. We're going to talk about Daeron the Daring later in this episode because the uncertainty of his death allowed false claimants to appear. And as remember we said that earlier, uncertainty is the power source here. If you have uncertainty, imposters can flow in from that. They're like, oh, that summons the imposters. Whenever there's uncertainty about someone dying, that's their cue to get started. The uncertainty is the point. And I don't just mean the uncertainty of wait, there's too many Richards and Edwards here. But that might be enough, right? Just say, hey, I'm King Edward. Story checks out. I'm King Henry. Yep. Story also checks. I'm King Richard. Yep. Story checks out. Anyway, the fact that everyone but the conspirators were in the dark about what happened to these two princes with strong claims, nobody knows what happened to them, right? Everybody assumes they were killed, but we can say that now, hundreds of years later. At the time, it wasn't quite so certain. It was like, did he kill them, or did he have them hidden? Maybe he's got them stashed somewhere. It wasn't sure until a lot of time had passed, and it's like, okay, well, they're definitely dead now. It's been 30 years. But again, in the current moment, So that opened the door for imposters, and these imposters have a lot to do and a lot of inspiration for Trystane Truefire, Perkin the Flea, and Gaiman Palehair. Our powerful Song of Ice and Fire parallels. Let's get to it. First, Trystane Truefire and Perkin the Flea. Let's start this section with an introductory quote about the kings. Quote.
The first was Trystane Truefire, a squire to a disreputable hedge knight named Sir Perkin the Flea, who Sir Perkin declared was the natural son of Viserys I. After the storming of the dragon pit and Rhaenyra's flight, the shepherd and his mob ruled much of the city, but Sir Perkin installed Trystane in the abandoned Red Keep and began to issue edicts.
Trystane himself was a relative nobody. He was a squire to Sir Perkin the Flea, and Sir Perkin the Flea was a hedge knight. But these were particularly ambitious people, both of them. I assume Trystane had silvery hair, maybe blondish hair, something that could maybe identify him as a little bit Targaryen. It would have helped sell the lie, but we don't have a description on him, so I can't be sure of that. It just seems to, it would fit. They had a brief but notable run. As it said in the quote, they actually took the Red Keep. They convinced the guards inside to open the door, that they would be treated safely. They weren't. They killed them all. And they even got, because of that probably, the small council were like, yep, we'll do whatever you want. Larry Strong worked with them. Orwyle worked with them. They're like, even Corlys worked with them. They're like, yeah, we don't want to be killed, so we're your small council now. And he's like, well, this, and they were all for it because it helped legitimize them. Like, well, we got an actual group of nobles as our small council, famous people. That might actually help make this work. So they started issuing edicts, and they took 4 of the 7 city gates, some of it by subterfuge, some of it just by offering deals to them, and some of the captains were killed. Some of the loyalists were killed. And he even whipped Mazzaria through the streets, and she did not survive that. So some of this was going back and forth. Some of the edicts were against the tyranny that was happening during the war, as both sides sort of pushed a little harder on the populace to get extra money and soldiers and stuff to fight this war. And before the war as well, there were issues in King's Landing. So there's a lot of unrest, unhappiness with some of the leadership from before. And so they were issuing edicts that repealed some of these unpopular laws. There was a lot of this. There was, hey, they changed the laws for the Kingswood. Like, you can hunt small animals there now. You can do this and that. Different things that were allowing people to get food and survive. So common appeal to the common born, which makes sense because that's who was going to fill their armies had they managed to get so far, which they didn't. But, it was a reasonable attempt. So Trystane was eventually betrayed by Perkin in exchange for a pardon, right? Trystane very foolishly allowed all these nobles to negotiate out of his presence, and they negotiated his end and pardons for everyone else. So Perkin the Flea was pardoned, but then he participated in the poisoning of Aegon II, which earned him an execution from Craig and Stark. But he took the black. However, before he took the black, he killed Sir Alfred Broom by pushing him off the drawbridge onto the spikes.
Not such a bad guy, Sir Perkin, I think.
Yeah, killing Sir Alfred Broom was a feather in his cap there.
The Mazzaria thing, but hey, he killed Alfred.
Yeah.
Mazzaria's a little troublesome anyway, so
Yeah, Book Mazzaria is not such a good person. So we'll return to their peril in a moment, because we got to set up both parallels because these things happen together. Also, the parallel for this next character came first in real life, but second here in Westeros history. It's a little confusing, but we'll straighten it out here in a second. Gaiman Palehair. A quote about him.
This is who I support. Well, this is the figurehead I support. The other king was curiouser still, a child who became known as Gaiman Palehair. The son of a whore, this 4-year-old boy was claimed to be a bastard of Aegon II, which was not improbable given the king's bawdy ways in his youth. From his seat in the House of Kisses atop Visenya's hill, he gathered followers by the thousands and issued a series of edicts. His mother later was hanged, having confessed he was the son of a silver-haired oarsman from Lys. But Gaiman was spared and taken into the king's household. In time, he befriended Aegon III, becoming his constant companion and food taster for some years, before dying of poison that might have been intended for the king himself.
So these are two kids who looked similar to each other. They were both pawns of adults who took advantage of their claims. So you can kind of see on paper why they would become friends. They have a lot in common in their early upbringing and, looking similar. But a deeper look into this mystery shows that it probably wasn't Aegon III who was the target of that poisoning. It was a dessert that was poisoned, and he did not eat desserts. So this doesn't make any sense, right? Unless they just had no idea what they were doing. It makes more sense that they were trying to poison his wife, his betrothed, because Unwin Peake wanted it to be his daughter who was his betrothed. He was very upset. Anyway, that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the pretending and stuff. It's just, for completion's sake. So Gaiman ceased to be a pretender the moment the fraud was revealed. His mother confessed, as it says, and then she was hanged. But that's why he was allowed to live. He's like, yeah, my mom confessed. I'm just a kid. I didn't do this. Like, I don't have any agency here. And yeah, it doesn't look good to execute a child, right? Especially one who isn't a threat. Like, this kid is outed as a fraud. Everybody knows it. He's not a danger anymore. It's like, Gaiman Palehair rises again. Like, how? How could he do that? Everybody knows. So he's not important politically, which is why he could be a food taster. He's like, well, yeah, he's also, we don't care what happens to him. It was very sad when he died because Aegon III lost one of his only friends, but that's also kind of not related to our topic here. Earlier, we teased a strong historical parallel here, and indeed, let's talk about it. Lambert Simnel. What a name. Lambert was discovered in a way that child actors are often discovered, and I mean exploited. Yes. The actor comparison is extra on point here because a priest named Richard Simon wanted to be a kingmaker. He's like, you know what? I'm going to be a kingmaker, a Yorkist kingmaker. Recall your factions, York, Lancaster. Remember, Stark, York, Lancaster, Lannister, and then Tudor that came out of it all. Simon taught this common-born Lambert, who wasn't even named Lambert. He was named John, probably. So think about this. He was actually John. They called him Lambert, and they made him into King Richard. And then they made him into someone else. This kid had a lot of identities. He's like Arya. So many identities on a kid who wasn't even like 10 years old. Anyway, he taught him how to act. This is a little bit of Aegon VI, Young Griff vibes. They educated him and taught him how to act royal and courtly. And he did look like the sons of Edward IV. He's the seed is strong type business here. Some people actually think he might have been a lost descendant, but probably not. Anyway, if you recall our Wars of the Roses episode, this was the younger of the two princes that they were trying to impersonate here. He also declared, if you recall, Richard III not only killed his nephews, the two princes in the tower, he also moved to make them illegitimate. So it was like a double whammy to remove their claim and remove their lives. So it's interesting that this Lambert Simnel, under the auspices of priest Richard Simon, the kingmaker, had him impersonate a king that was declared illegitimate. So you're a pretender king that was named illegitimate. So he had to overcome two of these obstacles, which he did not. So presumably the thought was, if we win, this legal problem, this illegitimacy can be solved. It's a legal issue. We can smooth that over. We can get the courts to solve that for us, which is probably true. It's a good parallel to Joffrey, right? if Joffrey had lost the throne, if they had lost and tried to get it back. You'd have imposter pretenders. They would also have to face claims of being bastards, of being illegitimate, just like Lambert might have had to, as impersonating a person, King Richard, or Prince Richard, who was declared illegitimate by his uncle Richard. So after all this planning to make Lambert Simnel an imposter, they crowned him as King Richard. They changed their mind. They're like, wait, hang on a sec. Richard Simon hears a rumor, along with his fellow conspirators. They hear a rumor that the son of George, who was the younger brother of King Edward and King Richard, he had a son who was the Earl of Warwick. He supposedly died in captivity at the Tower of London, just like the princes in the tower. So Richard Simon instead changed this, change the plan. We're not going to make our fake Richard, or our fake boy here, into Richard. We're going to make him into the Earl of Warwick. They changed which imposter he was after crowning him. This is crazy, right? And it gets even crazier because it was a false rumor. The boy didn't die in captivity. He was still alive. So Lambert Simnel impersonated a living child instead of a dead one, with the goal of overthrowing Henry VII at the time. This is, I'll keep track of all these Henrys. So what did they do? Henry VII is like, I've got the real Richard here, or the real Earl of Warwick here. I'm going to parade him through the streets. By the way, the real Earl of Warwick's name was Edward. Yeah, of course. So they call him Warwick because his name is Edward, and that's confusing. So they actually did crown him as Edward VI, but he wasn't actually a sitting king. So they paraded the real boy through the streets. Like, look, he's not dead. He's right here. They're making stuff up. But think about what year this is. News did not spread quick enough. The Yorkist army was already on the way when this parading happened. So they're like, news is not going to spread fast enough for the imposter to be outed. And the imposter wasn't crucial. The Yorkists were just looking for an excuse to invade again and try their hand at overthrowing the Lancasters or the Tudors. So they're like, this was just a bonus. They're like, oh, we got a false claimant, imposter too? Let's do that. Let's name him Edward VI, or crown him Edward VI, and go for it. They would have done it anyway, is what most historians believe. They would have just made a naked attempt at conquest with, they don't need this kid. But it helped. But ultimately it failed because the rebel army was defeated in Ireland at the Battle of Stoke Field. Simons was captured, but because he was a priest, they didn't kill him. They just imprisoned him for life. Gaiman Palehair's mother was not spared, as we saw, so the perpetrator, the main conspirator in both these cases, had different fates, whereas the reverse is true for the claimants. Whereas Gaiman Palehair eventually died to poison. Simnel, he was also pardoned because he was 10 years old, just like Gaiman Palehair. They're like, this is a boy. He didn't do this on his own. This wasn't his plan. This wasn't his agency. So they let him go. They're like, we're not going to let you go. They gave him a job as a spit turner. Not that different than a food taster, except way less perilous. Kitchen related, food related, right? But he rose higher, which maybe Gaiman Palehair would have if he hadn't died so young. Simnel actually became a falconer. Yeah, that's a pretty good job. Royal falconer. Yeah, probably good pay in that. Not much danger, not much, pretty good prestige. So it worked out all right for Lambert Simnel. Happy ending for him. And he might even still have descendants out there. There's Simnels that probably relate to him. He didn't die of poison, that's for sure. And of course, Lambert Simnel leads us back to Aegon / Young Griff, because it's not just the appearance, but that is important, but the training in secret to make him a king in secret, like teaching him courtly manners, taking a regular person that wasn't raised that way and pretending that they were. Also, they're both the sixth, right? This is Edward VI. He was crowned as Edward VI, and Aegon is Aegon VI. Now this brings us back to our previous example of Perkin the Flea, Trystane Truefire, and their historical parallel, Perkin Warbeck. The dead giveaway, of course, is the name Perkin. There are a few other Perkins in The Song of Ice and Fire, but not many. This is probably the most famous by far. This guy didn't look like the sons of Edward IV. He looked like Edward IV specifically. So he didn't have any like person backing him. He's like, hey, I look like that former king. I'm going for it. But he did the same thing Lambert Simnel did, or his conspirators did. He claimed to also be that same dead younger prince in the Tower, Richard. They were like, it almost worked for him. Why not? And everybody exposed that one as a fraud. So it's still kind of an open title to be grabbed. I can be the Richard. He claimed he had been spared. Yes, they killed my older brother, Edward, but they spared me because I was young at the time. I took an oath not to reveal myself until now. A holy oath. I couldn't say anything until now. Yeah, it's so convenient, isn't it? But it makes me wonder, will Aegon, young Griff, do the same thing, something like that? Like, I couldn't reveal myself until now. You know, I had to keep my secret. The enemies of my family are legion, and I had to hide, blah, blah, blah. He's got to make statements, right? This can't just be, hey, I'm back, y'all. And I think there'll be carefully written statements engineered by Varys, a master of such things, right? So we haven't gotten to this phase of Aegon's claim to the throne yet. We've only gotten to the beginning of the invasion. We haven't really seen how the propaganda and how the getting people to believe that he is what he says he is we haven't seen that take root in Westeros yet. That's to come, and I'm pretty excited about it. This guy also had coins minted in his name. He was really deep into it. He was like, I'm going to do all the things a king does. Don't forget who else did that in Westeros history, Daemon Blackfire. That was even a part of the plot in the Mystery Night. Remember, the snail guy, the snail jouster, got mad at his squire for accepting a Daemon Blackfire gold coin. He's like, this is treason to pass this currency around. They really came down hard on it, right? Like Trystane Truefire, Perkin Warbeck stoked anger by referring to unfair laws, especially taxes. Yeah, that was one of the ones that Trystane Truefire issued an edict against, was the unpopular taxes of Bartimos Celtigar, which were wartime taxes. When this in particular case, when Perkin Warbeck landed in, I think it was Cornwall, he was like, yeah, taxes are too high. Taxes are too damn high. I'm going to lower taxes. just a reminder that I'm going to lower taxes is something politicians have been promising for forever. And a few of them actually do it, but only a few. This guy made multiple landings in England. Didn't succeed. Went to Ireland to get support. Went to Scotland to get support. Went to Burgundy to get support. Remember, if you want to fight England, Ireland, Scotland, Burgundy, and maybe Wales are your allies. Wales wasn't involved in this one, but, you know. His imposture went really far, though. He was called King Richard IV by other monarchs. They were like, yep, that's King Richard IV, all right. He went to the funeral of the Holy Roman Empire, Holy Roman Emperor, and they were like, presenting King Richard IV. But he actually got married to a woman named Lady Catherine Gordon. He got married under the auspices of being this king. But this is actually the biggest clue that everyone in on it knew that he wasn't really Richard. Because this was a very minor noblewoman. If they believed he was really King Richard, he would have married someone way higher born. This was a minor noblewoman. So that's a giveaway. And this is consistent with what we see in A Song of Ice and Fire with Joffrey, Jane Poole, and others, which is that they know, but they're not going to speak up. Who's going to say in Roose Bolton, like in Roose Bolton 3, that's not really Arya? Yeah, a good way to die, right? Same thing with Joffrey. Like, who's going to stand there and say that's not really, Robert's son? Well, Ned will, but very few others will, right? Stannis will, but only with an army behind him. So it's either they can't do anything about it or it's against their best interest to even try, or both. So real world, this has happened as well. Now, a certain Robert Clifford joined this conspiracy of Perkin Warbeck as a double agent. He lied to his fellow conspirators, telling them, yeah, Perkin's really King Richard, to get them to join, to see who would join, right? It's like a false flag. It's like, yeah, we got the real deal. Now who's with me? And then when the who's with me revealed themselves, he made a list and gave it to the king, gave it to King Henry, and then Henry went and had those people arrested, and most of them were executed. It would be kind of like if someone was like, yeah, this King Aegon's the real deal. Hey, friends in the Reach, who's with us? But it turns out this was somebody on the Lannister side and had them all killed. Now, in the end, Perkin Warbeck confessed in writing to his true identity. Well, he was forced to do this, so who knows what was actually true, and this guy wasn't exactly honest in the first place. We don't know. But he also was not, surprisingly, now you can get why they didn't kill young Lambert Simnel. He's a boy. He didn't really have that much to do with it. Like, why execute a child? It doesn't look good in this era of Christianity and you're trying not to kill, So killing boys is pretty bad. But this was a man, a full-grown man who tried to impersonate a king and got really far with it. You would think they'd kill him, but they didn't. They kept him in captivity, just held on to him like, you can chill here. And he tried to escape. And they still didn't kill him. They got him back, put him in the Tower of London. They're like, okay, we're going to give you a tougher prison. And he was put inside the Tower of London with the current Earl of Warwick, another Earl of Warwick, the 17th Earl of Warwick, also named Edward. Those two conspired together to try to escape. They did, but they got caught. This time they're like, all right, that's it. Execution. His wife, Catherine Gordon, became a lady in waiting to the royal family. So not a terrible ending for her. So doesn't this show you how history provides so much raw material for George? There's so many stories that sound fictional that aren't. They're just too, like, what's that word? Stranger than fiction. Yeah. But this also helps keep it authentic. George's stories, his writing, one of the things he's so amazing at is creating scenes, dialogue, and characters that speak in ways that feel real. And he backs this up with things that are authentic. And we know they're authentic because they really happened. And when you hear that they really happened, it makes George's world feel more real because this is not made from whole cloth. It's a combination of his invention, his imagination, his creativity, and what he's learned from the real world. The Dance of the Dragons. We're not done with the Dance of the Dragons. It gives us another brief pretender whose death opened the door for imposter pretenders. Daeron the Daring. During the war, Daeron was the most effective of the Green Dragon Riders. His case showed how effective a dragon and an army working together could be. Disciplined, organized, and they dominated the Southern Reach, winning a number of battles against the Black faction. Thanks in part to the two betrayers, in large part to the two betrayers, Daeron and Lord Ormond Hightower and the Greens won the first Battle of Tumbleton, right, with Hugh Hammer and Ulf White being the two betrayers, of course. Now, it really should have been Aemond who was the most effective of the Green Dragon Riders, but he was too erratic, too driven by emotion, maybe a little crazy. And when Aemond died, Daeron actually became the Green claimant for the throne because Maelor was already dead, and people thought Aegon II was dead. He wasn't, but neither Daeron nor these other lords of the Reach knew that. They thought he was dead. So Daeron's the pretender to the throne. Easy to forget or miss that he was technically the claimant for a little while. So many actually wanted to proclaim him king, and he was all for it. And this is why the imposters of him that came along later had so much potency, because he was an actual pretender. He was very close to getting the throne. And then it would have been confusing when his brother revealed himself, hey, I'm still alive. Like, oh, well, I guess it's yours. Had the Reach Lords continued to work together as they had been for a while, things might have gone pretty well for them because they had worked together. It went well. They won the Battle of Tumbleton. But then bad leadership really started to take over, just like it was fairly true for the Anarchy. There's so many bad decisions made during the Anarchy, just baffling military decisions, weird political decisions, legal rulings that harmed the side making them. Yeah, just bizarre choices. Bad leadership is just a simple way to put it. And obviously that was the case with the Blacks and the Greens. Very few of leaders on either side were competent, and a lot of them were incompetent. But the real distraction here was Hugh Hammer making his move instead. Yes, Daeron's the claimant, but Daeron was young, and Hugh Hammer's like, I've got the biggest dragon now. I've got a better play for the throne than this boy with his small dragon. And this caused infighting amongst the Greens. The caltrops were like, all right, well, we're going to assassinate the two betrayers. So we got two princes in the tower, two betrayers, two kings under the moon of three kings. Lots of pairs today. This, of course, was great for the army headed towards them for the Riverlands, right? The Riverlands army led by Alan Velaryon and Bloody Ben and Black Alley Blackwood and all those folks. They were headed for Tumbleton, and it really worked out well for them that the Greens were infighting because they were very unprepared for this attack. So when the Riverlands army shows up, as you all probably remember, neither of the two betrayers nor Daeron managed to get to their dragons in time to actually use them in the battle. And that was a huge part of why the Second Battle of Tumbleton was a huge win for the Blacks, a reversal of the First Battle of Tumbleton. Here is what Fire and Blood tells us. Quote,
"So intent were they upon their own conflicts and rivalries that they had all but forgotten their true foes. Ser Adam's night attack took them completely unawares. Before the men of Prince Daeron's army even knew they were in a battle, the enemy was amongst them, cutting them down as they staggered from their tents, as they were saddling their horses, struggling to don their armor, buckling their sword belts. Most devastating of all was the dragon. Sea smoke came swooping down again and yet again, breathing flame. 100 tents were soon afire. Even the splendid silken pavilions of Ser Hobert Hightower, Lord Unwin Peak, and Prince Daeron himself. I want to say that again, I'm sorry. Even the splendid silken pavilions of Ser Hobert Hightower, Lord Unwin Peak, and Prince Daeron himself.
Earlier I said Alan Velaryon, I meant Adam Velaryon. Of course, Alan was never a dragon rider. So Lord Unwin and Sir Hobert, even though their tents were set afire, as this quote tells you, they survived. But Prince Daeron was never seen again. And accounts differ as to what happened to him. And what did we tell you? If accounts differ, if there's confusion, then it opens the door for imposters. That's exactly what happened. But first, here are the tales we're actually given about what happened to Daeron. Quote number 1.
3 conflicting accounts exist as to the manner of death of Prince Daeron Targaryen. The best known claims that the prince stumbled from his pavilion with his nightclothes afire, only to be cut down by the mirror sellsword Black Trombo, who smashed his face in with a swing of his spiked morning star. This version was the one preferred by Black Trombo, who told it far and wide. The second version is more or less the same, save that the prince was killed with a sword, not a morning star, and his slayer was not Black Trombo, but some unknown man-at-arms, who, like as not, did not even realize whom he had killed. In the third alternative, the brave boy, known as Daeron the Daring, did not even make it out at all, but died when his burning pavilion collapsed upon him. That is the version preferred by Munkins' true telling, and by us.
You think if Black Trombo had been hired by the Greens, he would have changed his name to Green Trombo? So all 3 versions of this story have Daeron on fire. In the first 2, he runs out of his tent and is killed. In the third, he never makes it out of the tent at all. So really, these aren't terribly different accounts. He dies in all of them. He's on fire in all of them, and he doesn't get very far in 2 of them. So there's not much dispute here, yet the fact that there's any dispute at all opens that door a little, and with that door open, in come the imposters. Let's start with the historical parallel for these imposters. The false Dimitris, we mentioned them earlier. Shout out again to Matt Reeves for this, and this is the Times of Trouble that we referred to earlier as well. So first of all, we have Dmitry of Uglich, aka Dmitry Ivanovich, who was the youngest son of Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible. So the heir apparent to his older half-brother Fyodor I was kind of weak and sickly, so the country was ruled by a council instead, headed by this guy named Boris Godunov, who sent Dmitri, his mother, and her brothers into internal exile, because he wanted to keep his rule of the council through this puppet king, basically. Dmitri died under mysterious circumstances, probably killed by Godunov, and so that Godunov could become Tsar when Fyodor died. Now, later, the first false Dmitri appears. He entered history around 1600, and he made a strong impression on the Patriarch of Moscow, which is a big deal. The Patriarch of Moscow, big religious leader. Godunov is Tsar now, so he succeeded in that, but he tries to arrest this Dmitri. But Dmitri flees to the Polish border with Lithuania, so he's get a little bit outside of Godunov's reach. In 1605, 5 years later, a Polish-Lithuanian army backs him, plus anti-Godunov Russians helping him out, and they win the first battle, but then lose the second battle. Then Godunov dies, and some of the victorious Russians, they just beat Dmitri. They switched to his side because Godunov died. They're like, well, we got to be on the side of the guy who's going to be king, even though he just lost. So he married a Polish noblewoman, presumably as part of his deal to get this Polish army, but she didn't convert to Orthodoxy, which was a big problem because Russia was very Orthodox at this time, and there was a rumor that Dmitri was going to unite the Russian Orthodox Church with Rome, with the papacy, which is like, they didn't want that. That was bad. So this may have been a false rumor just to push back against Dmitri. Anyway, it led to a revolt that led he died. He was killed 10 days after his marriage and only 11 months into his reign. So this marriage to the not Orthodox Polish noblewoman was the death blow in his short reign of false Dmitri I. Now we have false Dmitri II, or the second false Dmitri. It's giving him an ordinal number. False Dmitri II, false Dmitri III. Yeah, it's like, no. The second false Dmitri appeared only 2 years after the death of this other one, or maybe even only a year and a half. He was probably a priest's son, or maybe a converted Jew that had a resemblance to the first false Dmitri. And like Aegon VI and Lambert Simnel, he was raised for this role. It was not just hey, I'm going to impersonate somebody. No, there's a lot of planning and teaching and learning how to act. So like learning how to be courtly, speaking other language, whatever, all the things that royals do. He had to be able to pass all these sniff tests and be able to behave like a royal person and not get caught. So he was impersonating a Muscovite boyar, which was a thing that was happening throughout the events here. He got tortured and falsely confessed under torture to be Dmitri. He's like, I'm Dmitri. I really am Dmitri. So that's amazing. He was tortured and he still held out he still convinced him that he was what he said he was. And then because he confessed under torture, it made people believe, even though it was a fake confession. So Cossacks, Poles, Muscovites all started to join him. They were like, okay, this guy's the real deal after all. Like tortured, and he's still that's pretty good proof. False Dmitri's wife, this previous woman that we talked about, she meets him and accepts him. She's like, yep, that's him. Obviously, she's in on it, I guess, but it really helped legitimize it. You get the belief that he was tortured and still made this claim that he was Dmitri. His wife says, yep, that's him. That's a lot of proof, but this was all fake. He led an army only a year later in 1608 to Moscow, won some battles, but then the King of Poland arrived and all his Polish supporters were like, nah, we're going to go to his, we're following our king, not you. And then, the Russian loyalists got Sweden on their side and marched on Dmitri, and he had to flee. And he was just killed 2 years later by another princeling. He got into a fight with a Tartar princeling and was killed. Drunken death, very ignoble ending. One more false Dmitri. Yes. The third one. He was supposed to have been a deacon. So there's a lot of religion behind all these guys, but that's partly because the church had so much power in Russia in this era. He was probably called Sidorka. Matt says he's the most enigmatic of the three, and I think I agree. He was more secretive, a little more mysterious. We know a little less about. He might have been the cleverest. He appeared only a year later after the death of the last Dimitri, and maybe the death of him in such an ignoble way was part of how this guy was able to get going. So he appeared in a town called Ivangord, proclaimed himself Dimitri. This was 1611, like I said, only a year later. The Cossacks acknowledged him as Tsar less than a year later, or about a year later, and he forced the gentry, the middle class and up, the wealthier people, to kiss the hand. Like he made them bend the knee, basically. But he had to flee. It didn't go that well, and they captured him and had him secretly executed, which is kind of odd that they executed him secretly. I wonder why they did that, because you'd think they'd want to execute him publicly so it would be widely known that this Dimitri was killed. But they must have had their reasons, and it worked, I guess. There weren't any more false Dimitris. So either way, that was the end of the Dimitris. Now we go back to the Darons, and you'll see. And this is the end of the war. So the Dance of the Dragons is where we're getting back to. Before the war actually ended, remember, Aegon emerges from hiding and is like, oh, Aegon's still alive. He's terribly wounded like his dragon. His dragon eats Rhaenyra and captures Rhaenyra's son, the future Aegon III. He then proclaims, quote,
"The time for hiding is done," King Aegon II declared. "Let the ravens fly that the realm may know the pretender is dead, and their true king is coming home to reclaim his father's throne."
Straightforward political speak here. My enemy is the pretender. I'm the true king. He reminds people it's his father's throne while ignoring that it's also his sister's throne. Rhaenyra was every bit his son or his daughter too, right? So it makes a lot of sense, right? The War of Words is a big deal because the War of Swords and Dragons is the front of it, but it's the War of Words that helps determine what side people fight on in the War of Swords and Dragons in the first place. But of course, at this point, Aegon thinks it's over. He thinks he's won. Of course, he didn't. Now, let's jump back to the Anarchy briefly. We're swirling through a lot of parallels, jumping from different time periods in both the real world and Westeros. Empress Matilda didn't give up the fight for England, but she did hand it over to her son, Henry. Obviously Henry, right? She's like, I'm done fighting for England. But her son's like, yeah, I'll keep doing it. I'll do it. Part of the reason she was done was that it wasn't going well. She'd already been booed out of London, basically. And her second husband, remember, she was married to the Holy Roman Empire. Well, he died. She remarried to Geoffrey the Fair, who conquered Normandy in her name in 44. Normandy in 44. That sounds like World War II, but no, not 1944, 1144. So she was now the Duchess of Normandy. She's like, you know what? I got the Duchess of Normandy. I got all these other things. I don't care about England anymore. Let me just do this. But like I said, her son, Henry Fitz-Empress, he was all about it. He basically inherited her pretender status. The anarchy was finally resolved by Stephen getting to keep the crown, but he had to knock his own son out of the line of succession and accept Henry, son of Matilda. So both sides kind of like, well, Stephen's going to be king, but the line is going to go through the original line it started with, through King Henry, father of Matilda. And this is Henry II. He became Henry II because King Stephen died within a year. There's no accusations of foul play, but I guess you never know. Certainly Henry didn't have to wait long. And in the meantime, Stephen's son, Eustace, the Black Prince, was not happy about being written out of the succession and started a war over it, but he died. He was a very effective prince. He was dangerous, but he got sick and died. Shortly after looting some temples, which a lot of people in that era, they, of course, blamed him looting temples on, that's why he died. Like, God punished you for that, man. So Henry II, who, like I said, became king after Stephen, and that's the end of the anarchy, he ruled for 45 years, so you could maybe compare him to Jaehaerys I. But that's a comparison for another day. That's a sitting king. So now here we go with the aftermath, and back to Daeron the Daring, because his name clearly did not die with him. Starting about 5 years after his death, so maybe around the year 135, 136, his shadow returned. Quote,
Whatever the manner of his death, it is beyond dispute that Daeron Targaryen, youngest son of King Viserys I by Queen Alicent, died at the Second Battle of Tumbleton. The feigned princes who appeared during the reign of Aegon III, using his name, have been conclusively shown to be impostors.
Sadly, we don't know who they were, what they did, how they were conclusively shown to be imposters. This is all stuff that would be covered in Fire and Blood 2, Blood and Fire. It's that era. That's where this happened. So Daeron looked like a Targaryen. We know that from his description. He favored his Targaryen ancestry, not his Hightower. So if he had looked like a Hightower, it probably would have been easier to impersonate him because you got probably a lot more light brown or dark brown haired people around than, Targaryen looking. Regardless, it's not that hard to find Targaryen looking people, right? Like Lys in the Free Cities, Volantis especially, you can find people that have that coloring. So that might be a good theory here. Because who supported these imposter princes? They didn't just show up like Aenys Blackfire and get executed, right? They probably came with armies, and it says they were troublesome. It says the realm, it was difficult, right? There was disputes about it. There was needing to be, these challenges needed to be put down. So they weren't simple. They weren't just something you could just sneeze at. They caused problems, though we don't know how big or how serious they were. And remember, this was after the era of dragons. Yes, the Dance of the Dragons had just happened, but so many of the dragons were killed. Already Targaryen supremacy was severely muted because of their loss of their ultimate weapon. So that's what anyone who's coming at them in this era is going on that calculation. It's like, hey, we don't have to deal with the dragons anymore. This dynasty might be a lot easier to knock off now. So these false Daerons almost certainly had that in mind. They're like, this is our chance. And if we don't take it now, someone else will, because the whole world now realizes these Targaryens might be vulnerable. The Targaryens would be eager to say, hey, we're still strong and powerful. They would be pretty keen on proving that to shut down further challenges to their supremacy. So like I said, we don't know a lot of detail about these false Daerons. There were at least 3, because it says several. It doesn't say 2. It doesn't say 1. It says several. That's at least 3. So there could even be like a 4th or a 5th. I'm guessing 3, because it seems a lot to have more than that, but hey, it's possible. So, and the time frame for this is sometime around 136 to before 157. So the first one would have been around 136, and the others would have been done by 157 because they all happened during the reign of Aegon III, and Aegon III's reign ended in 157. And of course, when this happened would give you an idea of how old these false Daerons were. If it happened in the late 130s, the imposters would have to be early 20s, because that's how old Daeron would have been. So on and so forth. So this could be a little bit like a young Griff or the Ninepenny King situation, where you've got a pretty strong claimant by name and reasonable, if not powerful, support behind them due to ambition or just to ambition. That's it. So in the quote also, it says that Viserys, or in that section of the book, it tells us that Viserys, as in the future Viserys II, Aegon's younger brother and hand, was chiefly responsible for dealing with these imposters. He was a very competent hand who ruled for 20 years. He managed things during Baelor the Blessed's time, so dealing with these imposter Daerons was probably easier than dealing with Baelor the Blessed. But again, we don't know. Now, Aegon III also named his firstborn son Daeron in the year 143, which might have been a way to sort of take a little steam away from possible future false Daerons. Maybe. Possibly. There's also the matter of the child of Alice Rivers and Aemond, who was put forth as a claimant, possibly as a pretender. Yeah, as a pretender. But we don't know what happened with that either, because this is also in that same time frame of where Fire and Blood 1 ends, and where we have some missing data for now. But definitely she and that boy were around in the same era, and we don't know what happened to them. Meanwhile, on the Iron Isles, another example comes to us from this era. Quote,
in the Iron Islands, a savage struggle for power followed upon the death of the Red Kraken. His 3 sisters and the men they had married seized Torrhen Greyjoy, the boy upon the sea-stone chair, and put his mother to death, whilst his cousins joined with the lords of Harlaw and Blacktide to raise up Torrhen's half-brother Roderick, and the men of Great Wick rallied to a pretender called Sam Salt, who claimed to be descended of the Black Line.
The Black Line, of course, is the line of Harren the Black, Harwin Hardhand, all those, the Hoare dynasty, Hoare. The Lannisters actually invaded during this chaos, and it was, I believe, I forget which lord it was, anyway, I forget. One of the Lannister vassals tried to actually seize the Seastone chair, and so he was sort of a pretender to the Seastone chair, but he didn't hold that. He lost it quickly. The Lannisters also, during this invasion, this claim that wasn't part of the plan, they were just trying to stop this uprising and settle the Iron Islands and get revenge on what they had done during Dalton Greyjoy's depredations during the dance. He certainly did a lot of damage to the West Coast and to the Lannisters and their vassals, so they were keen on revenge here. We don't know what happened to Sam Salt. He was presumably killed because he was captured during this Lannister invasion. It was very easy for them to invade because the Iron Isles were fighting each other, and they were also dealing with a power vacuum after the death of the Red Kraken. And of course, soon enough, the Iron Throne brought the Iron Isles back in under their auspices, and things died back down to normal for the Iron Isles. Here's an example a little farther off the beaten path that is historical, but is a comparison / parallel to the Blacks and Greens, and involves our earlier touched on subject of historical revisionism. This one also comes to us from Matt Rees. Thanks, Matt. In the 14th century, 2 lines of the imperial clan in Japan claimed the throne: the Northern Court and the Southern Court. Their rivalry was resolved in 1392, so only about 60 years before the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, so similar time frame here. This would be during the 100 Years' War, then, by that same reckoning. Every emperor of the Southern Court enthroned prior to 1392 was established as legitimate, and the throne was determined by Emperor Go-Komatsu of the Northern Court and his successors. Since 1911, more than 500 years later, the Japanese government retroactively declared the Southern claimants were actually the rightful emperors, despite the fact that all subsequent emperors, including the emperor of the time, were Northern Court descendants. So the reasoning here was that the Southern Court retained possession of the 3 sacred treasures, which are very important symbols of rule in Japan for the imperial court there. So they converted the emperors of the former Northern Court into pretenders. So like 500 years of reversing these guys' status. 6 former Northern emperors are now pretenders in history. Now, this is very much like how Rhaenyra was like written out of it. Like you can see this happen. They wrote her out right away. This happened 519 years later, or 21 years, 519 years later. They changed history to change who the pretenders were and who the legits were. It's wild, right? But you can, the words do have power like the swords and dragons, don't they? Sometimes they take a little longer to take root or to make their power felt. But yeah, that's pretty crazy that they just changed that. They're like, the present Japanese family is descended from Northern Court emperors, even though the Southern Court is the one that was made the legitimate one. So it's all very strange to me. Probably beggars further reading on my part. I'm curious. Thanks, Matt, for bringing this to my attention so I can look into it more. I love stories like that. History is fun. Our quote of the week. This one comes from Madeline Miller's Cersei, a book I really, really loved. The book is from Cersei's POV. This is Circe, as in the daughter of Helios and the Oceanid, which is a nymph, a sea nymph, an ocean nymph called Perse. So this quote is from the time that Odysseus was on her island. Remember, in the traditional myth, Cersei is the one that turns most of his crew into pigs. He spent his days working on the ship. In the evenings, we would sit before the hearth while the men ate their suppers, and at night he came to my bed. His shoulders were thick, carved from his warrior hours. I ran my hands across his ragged scars. There were pleasures there, but in truth the greater pleasure was after, when we lay together in the darkness and he told me stories of Troy, conjuring the war for me by spear by spear. Proud Agamemnon, leader of the host, brittle as badly tempered iron. Menelaus, his brother, whose wife Helen's abduction had begun the war. Brave, dull-brained Ajax, built like a mountainside. Diomedes, Odysseus' ruthless right hand. And then the Trojans, handsome Paris, laughing thief of Helen's heart. His father, white-bearded Priam, king of Troy, beloved by the gods for his gentleness. Hecuba, his queen with a warrior's spirit, whose womb had borne so many noble fruits. Hector, her eldest, noble heir and bulwark to his great walled city. And Odysseus, I thought, the spiral shell, always another curve out of sight. I began to see what he'd meant when he had talked of his army's weakness. It was not their sinews that had wavered, but their discipline. There had never been a parade of prouder men, more fractious and unyielding, each certain the war would fail without them. Madeline Miller's extremely talented. Her prose is the kind that sometimes I just had to reread what I just read. I was like, what? That was so good. I got to read that again.
That quote reminds me of the one about Stannis, Robert, and Renly.
Oh, that's pretty good. You're right. Yeah, from the blacksmith. Yeah,
yeah, totally. Where they talk about iron and yeah,
bronze and copper. Yeah, the shiny, the true steel, and yeah, you're right. That's a good one. But also beware, her books are sad. She is incredible, for example, at writing loneliness. This book Cersei is lonely, and she writes it so well. It is not the easiest read, but in some ways it is an easy read because it's so good, but in other ways it's like, whoa, this is heavy. HBO had picked this up to make into a show, but I don't think it's still under development. I think they dropped it. Maybe it'll get unshelved. Maybe it's just on the shelf. Maybe it's not permanently dropped. Hopefully it comes back. Hopefully they make it into a show, and hopefully it's good. She also wrote a great book called, what was her Achilles book? Song of Achilles, which is also really, really freaking good. So
yeah, that one was good.
Check those out. If you haven't, you can get them go to our website. You can get them through Amazon, through our links there, or Audible if you want to listen to them on audiobook. HistoryofWesteros.com. Blackfire rebellions and Jacobite risings. Now, we mentioned Aegon off and on throughout this episode, Aegon VI, a possible Blackfire descendant, a pretender either way, as we said, because he's trying to claim the throne, potentially an imposter. Let's look at a strong IRL parallel for him. James II of England and Ireland and James VII of Scotland, same person, different titles for different thrones. He was the last Catholic monarch of all three of those countries, England, Ireland, Scotland. Of course, it's all under one crown. He was deposed in 1688 in what was called the Glorious Revolution. Now, interestingly, part of the reason for his removal was they were trying to prevent a civil war, which they didn't. It still happened, but sorta, because maybe this wasn't a civil, maybe it was just like a civil conflict. It didn't maybe devolve into war. It's semantics. But the reason they were so keen on avoiding this or so worried about it was because the First English Civil War, that's the official name, First English Civil War, had only been about 40 years before this. So there was still a lot of let's not do that again. It was too recent. A lot of people who lived through it were still alive. So James had an army, but they deserted him and he fled into exile. He returned again in 1690, but he was defeated. And he went into exile in France, where he eventually died. What that meant was that the Hanoverian succession would prevail over the Jacobite succession. Hanoverian succession was the rulers who won, and they represented Protestantism at the time. And the Jacobites were Catholic. And that was the main dispute here, Catholic versus Protestant. And the Jacobites were the ones who thought that Stuart should be kings. This James Stuart, that was who he was. And the Hanoverians were the ones who thought, no, it should be the Hanoverians. They should be the Protestant kings. So you could say the real life version here would be like in Westeros if the Blackfires had actually won. But the Targaryens weren't eliminated. And instead, they spent years trying to get it back. But never did. So that's a missing angle for Westeros, is the religious part, like the Catholic Protestant. That's not a real parallel for Targ versus Blackfire. It got pretty bitter, but not as potent or as ideological as Catholic versus Protestant. Red versus Black wasn't quite as bitter or as deeply held. But even after James II / James VII died, several of his descendants and others continued to keep the dream and their claims and their status as pretenders alive. So his son was another James, had this status for so long, he became known as the Old Pretender. And his son, Charles the Young Pretender. So there was James the Old Pretender and Charles the Young Pretender, who were descendants of James II / James VII. So they weren't just trying to overthrow the Hanoverian kings. They were trying to overthrow Parliament, because it was Parliament that changed the rules. They were like, nope, divine right of kings isn't the same anymore. We're changing the rules for divine right of kings, and we're changing the way monarchy works. We're not going with birth. We're going with, choice, right? There's parliamentary choice, really. So it's like this. These are the two disputes. It's like, besides Catholic and Protestant, there's also the how we choose kings and what the basis of it is. There's a big root cause dispute. And that's why there's still people even today. There was a neo-Jacobite revival around 1890. Again, because of the deeply held religious beliefs in play here, they're like, no, go back 300 years. It should have been this guy. And then since it should have been that guy, that means it should have gone through all of his descendants instead of all of them. Right? So this dispute, it's not really happening anymore. But there still are people who think it that way. There's not like a powerful movement, but there are still people to this day that insist that it should be the Stuart kings, even though the Stuarts, they're extinct. I mean, in that name, there's obviously descendants of them that have other last names now. There's not really a parallel to trying to overthrow Parliament, because Parliament, there's not really an analog to Parliament in Westeros. The closest thing we could maybe come up with is if there was a war fought to overthrow the doctrine of exceptionalism, because they were trying to change the way that kings were viewed and what laws surrounded the choosing of kings, which is part of the doctrine of exceptionalism, saying, hey, Targaryens are special, we're better, we're different. Also similar to the Blackfire rebellions, and this is one of the things that make it isn't just that they fled overseas and they were pretenders for so long, the king over the water, that kind of business, which is what they called some of the Blackfires. It's because there were 4 different uprisings / campaigns, in addition to some sort of minor little movements that never reached the status of wars or uprising, like that neo-Jacobite revival in 1890. But in 1689, there was a campaign again of the Jacobites against England to take the throne. Again in 1715. Again in 1719. And then again in 1745. 26 years later, right? So I have definitely seen people look at the Blackfire rebellions under George's writing and say, this is unrealistic. There's no way this beaten dynasty would still be taking stabs 30 years later. Well, real life says otherwise. We've got more than 30 years apart. This is a wider range of time than the Blackfire rebellions were apparent or present, roughly. I guess if you count Maylease, which wasn't a Blackfire rebellion, that was 70 years later or 65 years later, which is similar to this. So anyway, the point stands regardless. And of course, what did we say? If you're invading England, who do you get on your side? France. Now, France was very Catholic, so they were even more excited and willing to be on the side. And that's why he was hiding in France in the first place. His exile was to France because they were like, yeah, you're one of us. But this time, since it wasn't just anti-England, it was anti-Protestant, you got Spain and the papacy. Of course, the papacy is number one on the list of get those Protestants. Or rather, convert those Protestants, one or the other. Either convert them or get them, one way or the other. And Spain, of course, is all about that too. Super Catholic country. Yeah. So making a claim through a great council, as I said before, I want to make sure that's clear here. That counts as being a pretender too. So Aenys Blackfire counted, even, and he was called a pretender, even in the text of Fire and Blood, or World of Ice and Fire, actually. Yeah, World of Ice and Fire. So again, Parliament had a lot to do with the legalities here, and that's a kind of a side topic, just a point of interest, that you have a ruling body that decides what determines a king. I mean, if you think back, somebody had to decide that in the first place. Somebody had to say the heir of the king is the firstborn son, or in different countries, the lastborn son, or the firstborn person, or just I get to pick. So it's a reminder that, yeah, Parliament changed this. Some other people changed this. Well, someone started it in the first place. It's not. It may have been a change from before that, before there was even monarchy. So we always have to remember that humans are always making these things up in the first place. It's like what George said about world building and canon. It's like, we're making all this up. All this is made up. All these are cultural creations, the titles, the decisions on who rules, who gets to be what. We make it all up. And that's a good place to leave it. We couldn't cover every case of a pretender, even in Westeros history. It would be a bit too much to simply list them all off. That would be kind of boring. If I just listed them, then I'd be like, yeah, that's not very exciting. Rickon Stark could be a pretender to the seat of Winterfell, right? We could call all the various Bolton attempts to overthrow the Starks in the long past and currently as pretenders to Winterfell. But we were mostly focused on royal titles today. If you go back before the Iron Throne, well, there would be a lot more royal titles. There were 7 kingdoms, plus other times when there were more than 7 kingdoms. So there would have been a lot of pretenders to a lot of those thrones that we just don't have names for, but certainly it happened. Truly, there are endless stories of both impersonations and pretenders in the real world. And some of those that escaped our notice might serve as great parallels to some of what George has created that we haven't had yet, right? Like, there's 2 sides to this. One is, there might be inspirations out there that I missed, that y'all missed, that I didn't cover, that Ashay and I didn't put in here, right? You might find one and be like, hey guys, look, this is probably a parallel. This might be an inspiration to George. I encourage you to send those to us because it's such a vast topic. There's no way we could get it all. And on the other side of this, as we said about Aegon and Dany and some of these other situations, it's not resolved yet. We have yet to see exactly what's going to happen. And in the process of seeing those get resolved, we might be able to, and are likely to, see more historical parallels as these things play out. We'll be like, oh, Aegon in this with John Cunning, that's kind of like that thing that happened in France, or that thing that happened with the Jacobites, or whatever. So there's more to come when more comes.
It's funny.
Yeah.
All the Stark kids are technically pretenders,
but
not in the way you mean, really.
Yeah. Yeah, because there is going to be a Stark succession crisis. We've talked about that a lot, and so it's like, well,
in that way, but I also mean they all are pretending to be other people in different ways, too.
Sansa's pretending to be Elaine. Arya's got a whole lot of identities.
John has to pretend to be a traitor.
John has to pretend to be alive,
And alive, yeah. A few things, they're all pretend in different ways. We have that flashback where they're all pretending down in the crypts.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, but not the type of pretenders we mean.
Nope. Good one. So a question here. Dornish Dame says, I wonder if the mother pretended Gaiman wasn't Aegon's and confessed only in part to save her son. Oh, maybe. Oh, as in she really believed sincerely that her son, Gaiman Palehair, was Aegon's. But in order to save his life, she lied. Yeah. That makes sense. And that's something a mother would do, or a father. And Ned pretends Jon is not Rhaegar's, just pretends it's his. It's the reverse, saying, yeah, this is my kid. Yeah, to save it. That's a great take, Dornish Dame. Excellent one. I like that. Yeah, it's something a mother would do, and it's a viable theory for sure. Trivia answer. The Moon of Three Kings, which we could also call the Anarchy of King's Landing, actually only featured 2 kings. Which of the so-called three kings wasn't actually claiming to be a king? The Shepherd. The Shepherd, religious leader, if you can even call him that. Just mob guy, a mob ruler, a riot leader, riot specialist. I don't know. Definitely not a king. Didn't crown himself, but he certainly got
you could call
burned
him
at the stake.
A shepherd.
Hey, there you go. He's a shepherd. Shepherd. Yeah. Shepherd of rioters. We mentioned some other episodes that relate to this one, such as the Wars of the Roses, of course, the Black Dinner of Scotland, The Dance of the Dragons, our long series with Radio Westeros, plus the Red Kraken and Red Kraken follow-up, the Lioness, the Seahorse, and the...
Kraken.
The Kraken, yeah, which is the part 2 of the Red Kraken. Those are Patreon episodes. You can also get them on our Spotify paid feed. And they were very relevant here today. Also, our Hour of the Wolf episode dealing with the fallout of Kragan Stark being hand for a short time and taking care of people like Trystane. Fire was the name he was given when he was killed, not True Fire. As well as people like Larys and Sir Perkin the Flea and Gaiman Palehair, other stuff like that. So that relates. Also, thanks to Nina for her advice and takes. She definitely knows a lot about history, and that is always valuable to me. Thanks to Joey Townsend for composing our intro song. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for our intro video. You can get Michael's maps, like this one behind me, by going to his website, claradox.de, Klaradox. Link is in the description. You can, what people usually do is you buy the file from him rather than buying the whole map. That way you can just have it printed yourself, and you know, there's not all that shipping to do. You just take it to your Kinko's or your FedEx or something like that. Well, same thing, FedEx, Kinko's. Take it to your local print shop and get it all big like this. Good deal.
Yeah, we have ours printed on a fabric material. So really the sky's the limit with that print file. You could take that file and print it on a shirt for yourself. You could, put a banner. It doesn't have to be
big old
paper.
flag. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, you have that file and you can print a cup for yourself. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Lots of options. Yeah, it's really good. Wide open. And finally, thanks to Aurelian Matthias Resius, Lord of House Aurelian, ruler of Domus Aurelianus and the Valley of Tanasi, wielder of Sol Invictus, a potentially Valyrian steel blade, keeper of the largest collection of books outside the Citadel with the motto, "We restore the world." And thanks to everyone else who supports us on Patreon or Spotify. You're the reason we can keep doing this. We make more from y'all than we make from sponsors. And if y'all want us to continue doing episodes like this, which frankly are... a lot of y'all love, but we get fewer downloads on. But we want to make episodes like this because they're fun, but they have to be viable for us because we do this as a living. So please support us if you can, spread the word, and tune in next time for more. You know what to do in the meantime. Valar, reread us.